You are now listening to the Purple Fox Podcast.
Update.
What's going on, everybody? This is Kevin Eze, your host of the Purple Fox Podcast, with another Purple Fox update. And this update is called Gilded Democracy, the Push for Populism. Regardless of your political affiliation or political leanings, if you're an active participant in political life, there's no doubt you feel the seemingly inescapable pull of the bicameral two-party system. Election cycle after cycle, each side makes its case to the base propping it up, claiming they are your enemy. They keep you from so-and-so, from receiving this and that, achieving that and this. If you had asked me 10 years ago who the good guys were, I would have given you an answer with a Star Warsian style certainty, empire and rebellion in mind. Democrats are the good guys, duh. As I've gotten older, much and more of the smokescreen seems to have cleared. Eventually, I came to the all too real conclusion that both sides are virtually the same. The major differences only highlighted as culture war theater so that the collective establishment has adequate cover to divide and conquer. Benjamin Ayanian of the White Mountain Independent sums up my sentiments on the matter perfectly in an article entitled "Midterms Highlighted a Failing Duopoly and a Need for Reform," stating, quote, "The message is clear. The American duopoly is failing the citizens of this country. A plurality of Americans continue to identify as independents, but the vast majority of voters cast their votes for one of the two major parties. Election cycle after cycle, voters go to the polls and often choose between two flavors they find somewhat repulsive. The country needs more options," end quote. Ayanian goes on to flesh out how elections need to be reformed for third-party growth and competition on the political stage, noting as an example the ballot process that mandates minority parties to collect more than 56,000 signatures compared to just 25 for Democrats and Republicans in the state of Tennessee. He's far from wrong in his claims of political discrimination, which is evidenced in the fact that any time a third entity slowly rears its head, attracting the exhausted and frustrated masses, this duopoly firmly and decisively cuts it down as a team with clever tactics and methodologies from both directions, much like the ballot policy he cites. So why such hostility towards another voice jumping into the mix? What is the entity that is constantly buried for the sake of the status quo? Well, when you take a closer look at our politics and push past the culture war noise going left to right, you then start to see the real issue. The actual problem goes vertically, from top to bottom. The large asset, big money class knows no real partisanship. The only enemy the titans of finance and industry have is that of true populism. No, I'm not speaking of white nationalism or whatever term populism is being twisted into these days. I'm referring to majority consensus channeled into political action, like the kind which manifested during the Gilded Age of America. Some men worship rank, some worship heroes, some worship power, some worship God, and over these ideals they dispute and cannot unite. But they all worship money. Mark Twain wrote these words to summarize the Gilded Age, the chaotic and industrious time period beginning right after the American Civil War, all the way up to the early to mid 20th century. Now, Twain recognized the exceptional greed that was characterized by this age. Workers were treated like disposable trash. Farmers were predatorily lent to while they fought through famine to eke out a living. And American legends like John Pierpont Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller cashed in what would be billions in today's estimates. Now, William Jennings Bryan, the presidential contender to the robber baron-backed William McKinley, and the father of Gilded Age populism, recognized that someone had to firmly vocalize the case for the common man. If left unchecked, the titans of industry would have fully and ruthlessly bulldozed the working class. An example of this is the point-by-point breakdown illustrated in his Cross of Gold speech. The large asset class of America was in favor of strictly adhering to the gold standard, while the common U.S. citizen pleaded for a system of bimetallism, advocating for silver use as well. Every argument, from trickle-down economics to banks playing a firmer hand in governance within the U.S. was masterfully rebutted by William Jennings Bryan. The speech concludes with a rebuttal of the argument made around the gold standard being kept in place because of international pressures. Bryan famously concludes with the words, quote, "If they dare come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the utmost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." End quote. Now, what sucks about populism having its name dragged through the mud for countless decades is that it could truly be the answer to the political instability of our time. If you take populism for what it actually is, an appeal to the people and their desired civic policy, you find the answer staring you in the face. The problem is that when selfish, greedy actors speak of populism, they're usually only talking about a certain subset of people, the people they want to rile up for their own political ambitions. Sound familiar? But what if we shift the optics on populism away from the left or right variety and focus on the entire populace for a moment? What if we decided to only move on policy with a majority consensus among all subsets of the political spectrum? What I started to call this new type of people-centered focus is centrist populism, a civic promise to the polity to take all perspectives into account and to move towards the majority with both sides in mind. I've been paying close attention to some of these policy issues, and I employ a 65% poll indication as a criteria or requirement. Many people would be surprised just how many issues overlap among partisans. So many. Workers' rights, marijuana descheduling and banking, anti-war legislation, criminal justice reform, and so many more exceed the 65% consensus threshold. But unless you religiously pour through polling data or follow organizations like Pew Research, you wouldn't see these lines of intersection. To add to the fog around this kind of data, the media does a brilliant job convincing the general public that this world is ceaselessly black and white, when in reality, this world is full of more shades of gray than we can count. Liberal and conservative media paint either side as the enemy, both sides employing ironically fascist ideologies to counter the other, while stating how each desires to wipe the other from the face of the earth. When I think about how the elite must be smiling from the rafters, watching the puppets of the culture war dance around, the gif of the guy grabbing a bowl of popcorn on his couch come to mind. You know what I'm talking about. Is it any wonder that the general public currently faces a recession and rising interest rates, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average soars back to its pre-COVID-19 highs? Look, I'm not outright against big money. Hell, I invest myself. I acknowledge the power of the dollar as a source of economic and social fuel for a project. After all, if it wasn't for Vanderbilt's ingenuity and foresight around the railroad industry, men like John D. Rockefeller wouldn't have had the foresight themselves to fill those trains, that vast amount of rail system with his Standard Oil, filling every American home with that product and powering the very machines that we still use to this day by or via that Standard Oil. And because of those railroads, men like Andrew Carnegie wouldn't have seen the value in strengthening them with a product called steel, and also building up the very skyscrapers that are still in existence to this day. Men like John Pierpont Morgan wouldn't have seen the value in this wide array of industry and built up these banks to invest heavily, creating the vast expanse of America we see today, however ill-gotten it was, and building on those ideas to find the funds to create General Electric, building the power that runs through our country and our nation. And from there, men like Ford wouldn't have seen all these innovations and whittled that down into the creative force that is the automobile, the vehicle that revolutionized our transportation in this country, and the thing that we've improved on decade after decade. I recognize their achievements and the jobs they create. It's invaluable, yes. But the fact remains that a lot of these men are greedy bastards who would do anything to keep us from collectively advocating for ending things like the carried interest loophole, a share of profits considered a return on investment and taxed as a capital gain rather than ordinary income, usually at a lower rate, or advocating for ending the flow of money on Capitol Hill, stopping these very men from stacking Congress in their favor, a la William McKinley. We saw how that turned out. And possibly many more throughout the future. We just don't know about it. They've gotten better at doing it. Of course they do it. They stack Congress all the time. I mean, this recent campaign finance violation charge placed on Sam Bankman-Fried showcases exactly how someone with the money can try and buy influence from both sides of the aisle to ensure that their agenda survives on the Hill. Just by measure of him being caught. That's the only reason why we know about him stacking countless money into the coffers of Democrats. And what we found out recently is him placing dark money bids on Republicans, even though they've been, puppeting or pushing him as some Democratic investor. And we find out the opposite side was true as well. Hypocrisy. If the vast majority of the American public were to shift their understanding of what could turn out to be a truly populist moment, we would sooner realize that we have far more things in common than things that divide us. No matter who is currently taking the blame in public, it seems that whichever type of leader or candidate takes up the populist mantle, liberal or conservative, the constant common thread is that financial interests coming from the top are the actual force holding down the majority class of citizens fighting for the issue in question. During the Gilded Age, politicians and industrialists pitted race against race at the lower income bracket level to turn heads away from the proverbial men behind the curtain. Black farmers and white farmers were forced to fight for meager scraps, while either side was blamed for the woes of the other. This, in effect, ended most populist movements before they could genuinely impact the country at large. What's here for us to learn is how powerful we actually are together. Our national paradigm needs to shift away from pushing other away to embrace those unknown parts that we call other to find what brings us together. At this point in humanity's long stint on this earth, we should realize that the elites fear the masses more than anything else. How many revolutionaries and philosophers need to drill that lesson into us before we finally become immune to media spin and propaganda? The main reason this paradigm persists is the lack of questioning done by partisans towards their respective parties. Now, I understand the need to put your full trust in a team to achieve success. But unlike sports, where team chemistry hinges on the synchronization of members into one channeled spirit, there are too many moving parts in politics. Those heroes you champion are almost certainly going to disappoint you with a vote on something you find corrupt, or take money from someone you despise to complete a project. It's inevitable. Even worse is that most of those supposed heroes align with the interest of the large asset class, forming the civically monopolized cohort many call the establishment. This is the collective blob, the very collective blob that ensures that no major piece of legislation completely rocks the boat or disrupts the policy to pocketbook pipeline in DC. Now, many organizations realize this and are actively mounting initiatives and undertakings to cleave this establishment duopoly apart. One such prominent entity is that of the newly formed Forward Party, which is achieving steady gains advocating for reform like ranked choice voting, a system in which voters have the option to rank candidates in order of preference, first, second, third, and so forth. Votes that don't help the voter's top choice funnel over into the next choice, and then the next one, and the next one, until a candidate is chosen with the aggregate. What initiatives like ranked choice voting make possible is something the Forward Party calls the fulcrum method. What this fulcrum method, entails is a small group of legislators, maybe 4 or 5, achieving the ability to occupy seats within the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, and essentially act as the rotating fulcrum of influence, much like when Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema would become the most important vote on certain pieces of legislation for the last 2 years. In this way, a third entity, however small, can take advantage of the fact that there is hardly ever more than a 3 or 4 seat majority in either house. Entities like the Forward Party plan to tap into any possible resource available to provide the disillusioned American populace an avenue to have their voices heard under duopoly control. Maybe if they succeed, opening the way for a whole host of possible legislation and possibly even a multi-party environment. We can start calling what we live in an actual democracy, instead of the establishment republic that it actually is. The one thing I'm certain of is that our current direction is not the way to anything but bloodshed. Maybe a little populism, pushed from the center, is just what this movement and this moment calls for. So with that, this has been your host of the Purple Fox Podcast, Kevin Cieze, with another Purple Fox update. Signing out.